Hello everyone, my name is Paul and welcome back to the new news. I hope that everyone's having a fantastic day. I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe, and if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. There's a ton of stuff that has happened over the last 48 hours as we continue to move here through the news, and there's a lot of stuff that has obviously impacted a lot of people throughout the world, which is why here at the new news, 100% of everything that we do is about charities and it is about helping people. So please be sure to go and check out that video description and check out all of the wonderful organizations that are down there, because they cover every aspect of the globe, and we're continually looking for more. And 70% or more of the donations that they receive go directly to their programs, meaning they go directly to helping people that are in need and people that are reporting on in these news stories every single night that we go live. So please be sure to check them out and give as much as you can if you can. And so be sure, if you can't give a lot, give a little. And if you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. One of the biggest things you can do here at the new news is to help us grow our impact and grow our channel. The more people that come here, watch the news, and become informed on the situations that are happening around them, the more people overall that will be able to pitch in and help the people that are in need. So if you can, that like and subscribe and sharing this amongst your friends and communities really does help the channel significantly and helps us reach more people, so that way we can impact more people's lives in a very positive way. And before we get here and into the news, we are looking at, of course, a lot of stuff that has to do with conflicts and a lot of very complicated situations. So if you happen to have any questions and you are joining us live here tonight, please feel free to ask them in the live chat. I'll be more than happy to answer to the very best of my ability any of the questions that you may have. To give you an idea as to what my expertise may be, I started the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020, and I served as an O-352 anti-tank missileman and a corporal with 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. During that time, I did 2 tours to the Middle East. My first tour to the Middle East was between October of 2017 through March of 2018, and I served in Syria for roughly 4.5 months, with about a month and a half in transition in the country of Kuwait. I then came back to the United States, where as within my unit, I actually ran the company armory and worked in logistics for about 2.5 years. And then after that, I ended up going back to the Middle East between October of 2019 through March of 2020. And during that time, I ended up spending most of my time in Kuwait as the Javelin team leader for the crisis response company. From there, I actually went to the Baghdad Embassy complex on New Year's of 2020, where I oversaw all anti-armor operations over the entire Baghdad Embassy complex and was there to provide safety and security to those inside and to resecure the U.S. Embassy after 4,000 protesters and Katiba's Hezbollah militants ended up attacking it. After that, I went to Saudi Arabia and down into the Red Sea, where I trained Saudi Arabian Marines preparing to deploy to Yemen. I'm a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armor doctrine. I'm also a fully cross-trained machine gunner, a fully cross-trained rifleman, and a partially cross-trained radio operator, as well as a fully CLS or certified or a combat lifesaver certified Marine, meaning I've received additional medical training on top of what most Marines will receive in order to assist Navy corpsmen. And I do have real-world experience in providing real-world aid to casualties, mostly in my time in Syria. Outside of that, I also, of course, am very well versed in small unit leadership tactics, but at the strategic level, I was never formally trained. So most of my information on that level and that scale will be inferences from what I do know from my obviously from my experiences. Outside of that, I do have an interest in geopolitics and human geography, as well as history and science, and so I do try to remain as well-rounded as possible, but I claim not to be an expert in any of these. But at the end of the day, it does not matter, because ultimately, I ask that you as the viewer, if you have an interest in any of these topics, to please do your own research. There is no substitute for doing your own research on any of these topics, and I highly implore that you become even more informed than what we're able to provide you here on our short time here on the channel. And if you would like a starting point for any of your research, please feel free to jump onto our website. The link's also in the description, as every single one of these maps, clear back to shortly after we started the channel, is actually archived, and you can actually look through all of our information or follow along with our bullet points, as even this one, as we are looking at tonight, is currently available there, and you can follow along with us as we go through the streams. And without further ado, we immediately jump into our special report, which is coming from the country of Ukraine, which has been embattled for over a year now in a long invasion of the country from the Russian Federation. Though this war has honestly, the Russo-Ukrainian war has honestly been going on for very much longer than that, 9 years since 2014. We start off here in the capital of Kyiv, where we find that another mass drone attack has occurred. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, quote, on the night of February 27th, Russian occupiers attacked Ukraine with Iranian Shahed drones. Ukrainian air defense forces shot down 11 of 14 such drones. 9 enemy drones were shot down in the airspace of Kyiv. There were no victims and no hits on infrastructural objects. And we do get this from the Ukrainian Air Force, 11 drones destroyed. And so they're just providing a quick report on that. And we do actually have a very interesting photo. This is very reminiscent of what you would probably really more or less find from the Second World War. Those searchlights, those very powerful searchlights, are searching for, these relatively slow-moving drones, over the night skies of Kyiv. And this is something that's very reminiscent of what we see, from history, from days gone by in history, especially the Second World War, the mass use of floodlights and searchlights trying to search for enemy aircraft or enemy, objects in the air. Unfortunately, we also have the solemn duty of reporting, of course, the child casualty update from Ukraine. This is something that is coming out very regularly from both the Ukrainian parliament as well as the General Prosecutor's Office. Today, it comes from the press service of the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights, and they say, quote, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 461 Ukrainian children have died, 927 children have been injured. Most victims among children are from the Donetsk region. Moreover, 350 Ukrainian children were reported missing. And this does not include over 16,000 children which have reportedly been forcefully deported into Russia, are now currently with either Russian families or in the Russian social services system. Regarding some of those searchlights says you can also, to some degree, blind or disorient pilots if they hit right, or way back then. To an extent, I mean, of course, when you shine a bright light into someone's face, obviously it kind of blinds them and stuns them. However, most of the time, these searchlights aren't really going to do that because they're going to hit the underbody of the aircraft, the underbody of that fuselage. And so it really doesn't necessarily affect the pilots up in their cockpit. Now, another very important thing to note is that when you're talking about actual aircraft that are piloted by people, you have to look at it as being that whole effect of shining a bright light in a dark room kind of effect. Yes, the shining a bright light into a dark room shows you what's happening in that room. But more often than not, it also makes you very clear as day to everybody else in that room. When you turn that light on, they immediately identifies you. So it's a two-way kind of street when you're looking at the usage of lights, especially if you're talking about actual manned aircraft. Now with these drones, it's less so the saying. I mean, these drones are pre-programmed for their targets. Book of 40 says Russians are trying to alter their BCGs as assault combat groups. More support elements, including 12 flamethrowers, more drones, but less riflemen and tanks. So I have heard snippets about the restructure of the Russian military, and this is something that is likely going to happen more or less after the war. So the thing is that as of right now, and as we can tell, what they're trying to do is the Russians are actually shifting their military, but as a result of the horrendous casualties they have taken, it's called the BTG, not BCG, but BTG, or Battalion Tactical Groups. These are large units that comprise of every element needed for our ground force, whether you're talking tank support, logistical support, artillery support, mechanized infantry support, motorized infantry support, everything that is needed, for a fast-paced, hyper motorized, hyper mechanized ground warfare is comprised of these BTGs, and roughly about 15 of them are what Russia ends up starting with the war. About 15 BTGs actually cross into Ukraine, across the border, and actually start the invasion. At the end of the day, Russia only had, in total, the amount of logistical vehicles, numbers around anywhere from 6,000 to 6,500 to support those 15 BTGs. In active service, the Russians only have roughly about 4,000 to 4,200, meaning they only have enough to support about 2/3 of the military forces they actually deploy into Ukraine at the beginning of the war. And as a result of logistics breakdowns, failure in their leadership, failure in communications, and inability to seize initiatives, basically going off of the orders because of their top-down command structure, you're looking at a very difficult situation where the Russians have to pull out, but as a result, their BTGs, their battalion tactical groups, are horrendously mauled. And as you switch into the Donbass campaign, which later, comes in, late spring, early summer of 2022, the BTGs that they are deploying are actually parts of separate BTGs that were so heavily mauled, they basically took two of these things and made one whole one, which doesn't work necessarily as well as you think it would, because while a number, on paper, the numbers match up, cohesiveness, understanding, different types of of the standard operating procedures, SOPs, and things like that are going to differ very different. They're going to be very different between one unit to another. So it's not just an easy fix of just smashing two units together and hoping that they work cohesively. This is why units train extensively together in any military. There are cohesive one singular unit, and they operate as such with their own standard operating procedures and their own understanding, because it's just as much as understanding what the guy next to you is going to be doing as it is to understand your own job. And so, at this point in the war, these units have been so heavily mauled by the, by attrition. They've been attrited of their forces, their equipment, their troops, their manpower, and in some ways have been supplemented, but we have seen units be completely destroyed and existing only in name, including several different tank brigades that have existed since the time of the Soviet Union that fought in World War II. And so this tells us at this point, we're seeing them operating more as independent motor rifles brigades and things like this, not as necessarily as BTGs and not as those large cohesive units, simply because of a lack of universal capability of providing proper logistical support, proper artillery support, proper, equipment, proper manpower, because manpower shortages are playing a pretty significant role for the Russians, as well as, of course, the morale overall for the Russian forces has been, I would say, continually low. I would say they were low at the beginning of the war. They're starting to dig a hole now on the morale sector. But at the end of the day, they just simply can't operate BTGs in any way, and they can't really make any cohesive units at this point in the war. They're really kind of throwing whatever they can into the front line and hoping that bodies and equipment will do the trick. And as we can see, that simply just doesn't always work. While that quote has been attributed to Stalin, that quantity has a quality all of its own, it's never been proven, and the Russians are certainly testing that. I already have several questions coming in here. John Scott asked the question, do you think China will send weapons to Ukraine? I honestly don't think, will it just hype? And he's talking about, and William Young is kind of following up with some of the answers to that. And that's a very interesting question. And at the end of the day, it's very possible. Russia and China have kind of an alliance, but kind of not. It's more of a mutual beneficial thing for them to see kind of eye to eye. And when you look at these two countries, they definitely aren't, great friends, right? China has been very standoffish. They haven't necessarily outright spoken against Russia, but they've definitely been very much, on the sidelines. They've been very much watching very carefully of what Russia is doing. However, they do have common goals, and their common goals don't interfere with each other. And that is a very key thing to note. Now, Russia, being a former Soviet power, of course, a former communist country, obviously is going to have some ties with China, which, led its, Marxist revolution, its communist revolution there in China based off of the Russian ideology, the Stalinistic ideology. And when you're looking at these, two countries with their similarities and some of their history as well, and their, of course, their relative location, Russia's main focus is in Europe, and China has no interest in Europe whatsoever, at least when you talk about the strategic control sense. China's main focus is going to be in the South Pacific, and especially when you're talking about places Taiwan, the China Sea, the Sea of Japan, and especially when you're talking about possible, crossovers here with the Kuril Islands here into the north of Japan as well, which is currently in Russian territory and have been for a very long time, since the end of World War II. And so it's kind of like if you were to look at Germany and Japan right before the onset of World War II. They have similar ideologies. They have very major differences, which is a very key thing. And sometimes the differences can end up counteracting each other in their purposes. But just like Germany and Japan, had very similar ideologies and had similar goals, but goals that wouldn't interfere with each other on the strategic level. China and Russia kind of have that same kind of thing going. And right now, Russia is selling to China large amounts of oil at a they're taking a loss on it by about $2 to $4 a barrel for oil, and that includes transportation fees and also refining fees, which is they also have very high fees to do that because they are very inefficient in how they're getting this oil and refining it. But I digress. They have very similar goals, so it's very possible that China could have taken a stance. And we have seen Chinese equipment going over into Eastern Europe before. In fact, we saw them inside of Russia, specifically over here in Rostov-on-Don area. We saw them on flatbed trains. So it could be actually happening more or less under the table, but China has to take an official world stance, and they don't want to be put into a bad light, especially when you're talking about the difficulties China is already having financially from internal finance issues, but also, they're already kind of in the world's, I wouldn't say scope, but they're definitely there as a potential enemy on a large scale for a lot of the world. And so they rely heavily on exports of cheap goods. And when the world stops allowing that through sanctions, that doesn't exactly help their already desperate financial situation. We go back here and into Ukraine, where we actually hear from Ukraine Energo, which is the state-run energy supplier, and they stated that there has been no power deficit in Ukraine's energy system over the last 2 weeks, which is a very good sign. They have been very creative, and this is something that even other authorities from all over the world have noted, is how creative the Ukrainians have been in fixing their power grid, how creative they've been in fixing gas lines and water lines and different things, even if it's temporary fixes, but just trying to maintain those systems in a very difficult situation, and with limited resources to do so, with so much going to the war effort. And it's been pretty incredible. So to hear something like that, especially when you consider how many strikes there have been on critical infrastructure targets, namely energy infrastructural targets, over the last several months, it's very impressive to see how much that has significantly recovered. And that means that they have essentially completely recovered. While it may be just barely stable, it's stable enough that everybody, for the most part, should have electricity unless they're directly on the front lines. And that allows us to move over here and into the Donbass. And we can see just how extensive this war is once we get into the Donbass. And that's really where the majority of the fighting is ongoing. I mean, this is where the most significant kinetic activity on the front lines is actually occurring. And we, of course, start off with our latest daily Donetsk update coming from Pavel Kolenko, the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. And he said, quote, on February 26th, the number of victims of the Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 2 injured. And that does come from his official Twitter here. And we do see that graphic that he releases at 8 a.m. local time every morning. This one coming out over at 8 a.m. local time this morning. And he said that one person was injured in Keranik as well as one in Zoriani. So 2 locations right next to each other. Shelling is occurring across the entirety of the front, and many times they do not name the villages specific just because there are too many incidents. But since February the 24th of 2022, thus far, in just this span of time, a little over a year now, 1,387 Ukrainian civilians have thus far been killed, with an additional 3,096 having been injured. And this does not include areas currently under occupation, meaning places like Volnovakha, like this occupied city of Donetsk, or of course the city of Mariupol, which we know tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have died, are not factored into these numbers as they cannot be verified by the Ukrainian government, or at least even the regional government itself. That brings us to the front lines. We've heard about some of the losses here, and now we get a little bit more geolocation identification for us here, coming from on the outskirts of Bakhmut. This is along the northern flank, where we've seen the majority of the Ukrainian lines collapsing in this sector is here in the north. And unfortunately, Wagner Group and its troops did enter the outskirts of Bakhmut, specifically around the rail station here. And unfortunately, and we do have this actually geolocated to be able to take a look at this. So these are members of the Wagner Group. You can actually see some of them wearing Ukrainian uniforms. This is actually against the Geneva Conventions to wear the uniform of an enemy to conduct military offensive actions. You can do it to spy and conduct surveillance, but you cannot use it as a military action. And this actually, by doing so, actually you can be just executed on site. You can receive extrajudicial execution. However, the city of Bakhmut itself holds, and despite a lot of things being said on Russian channels, we really don't have a lot of evidence that the Russians have pushed into the major parts of the city whatsoever. Even here on the eastern side of the city, where they have been embattled significantly over the last few weeks, or I say last few weeks, but several months. But really, what we're seeing is the Russian forces outside of their small gains here in the north, here Yadane and up here into the northern parts near the Sadi Bakhmut rail depot here. We really don't see significant gains by the Russians, and the situation there, while very tense and does include a lot of close quarters fighting, the city may be partially encircled, but it's definitely not something we haven't seen before. You look at what happened to Mykolaiv, Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and any number of cities. You can see successes of Ukrainian forces, despite overwhelming odds, actually ended up beating the Russians quite heavily. And we're seeing kind of the same situation on Bakhmut. Bakhmut still holds, while it is a shell of its former self, quite literally. The city itself does hold under Ukrainian troops, and we see them defending very much just wave-style attacks, World War I wave-style attacks against defensive positions, with Russian forces taking crippling losses. These are losses that in any other military context would just be considered unacceptable, and these missions and orders would likely be changed. But unfortunately for the Russians, the Wagner Group does not care, as they were expendable, as they were already rotting in prisons to begin with. We can actually see some of that coming on here. The 93rd Mechanized Brigade, which has been reported on many a times throughout the duration of this conflict. The 93rd is very much a veteran unit, having taken place in almost every major engagement of the war thus far, are currently embattled in the streets of Bakhmut.
Антоны нахуй! Туда, куда надо! Бля, немцы, сука, по ноге попали. Пидорасы. Давай, выходи.
Something interesting that, you see here that really doesn't get explained is, why does this guy's friend start shooting his rifle? And if you can't tell, that's a BMP down there that he's getting ready to shoot at. Why does his friend shoot his rifle at an armored vehicle before he shoots a rocket at it? So there's a couple reasons for that. Because I've seen people kind of ask these questions before, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to shoot your rifle at an armored vehicle. Um, Actually, the first step to an anti-armor engagement is to shoot a rifle or machine gun at the tank or at any armored vehicle. Because when they button up the hatches, when they close the hatches on the vehicle, their vision goes from a very wide angle to a very small one. And so it obscures their vision and makes it very difficult to accurately identify and then engage targets quickly, which allows for this guy, not only is he getting suppressive fire that's preventing the enemy from shooting at the guy or carrying the rocket, but it also makes the vehicle itself an easier target for the guy carrying the rocket or the anti-armor weapon. Because they simply don't have the view, they're confused because of what's going on, and it's just an effective anti-armor weapon, anti-armor doctrine. That's exactly how I was taught, and we can see how effective it is. Book of 40 says, what kind of warhead is on that RPG? Looks small. Probably just a single charge warhead. It'd be a heat round, high explosive anti-tank round. Usually when you're talking about these kinds of things, you're looking at, on average, if you're going by American systems, rockets. I don't know the Soviet systems nearly as well, but rockets for Americans, you have like the 72 millimeters rockets, and then you have the 84 millimeter rocket for the Carl Gustav, the AT-4, or the M136 if you prefer. Those are usually the standard single-charge warheads, single-use warheads, and so we can assume that the Russians are relatively comparable in their anti-armor systems. The RPG-26, for instance, being pretty comparable to the M72A3 or A7. I apologize. The M72A7, the LAW, light anti-armor weapon. The RPG, the RPG-7, of course, being kind of the pinnacle of the Soviet arms anti-armor weaponry, ranging in its capability, but the RPG-7 being a very effective single-charge warhead, usually roughly about 84 millimeter in its actual warhead size. Roughly, keep in mind these aren't accurate, but it gives you kind of a good comparison, because the East and the West were in an arms race for a very long time, and so they have very similar capabilities with some of their weapon systems, with the Russians being definitely more, I would say, more simplistic, but because they were meant to be used in mass numbers, very large numbers, and they were more or less meant to... They're trying to do more with less when it came to their economy, but at the end of the day, they simply couldn't keep up, and it's part of the reason for the Soviet collapse is because their economy was tanked from trying to keep up with NATO expenditure. But, yeah. Another question that comes in from Bookham 40 is Bakhmut a pocket about to be closed, or are the pincers vulnerable to being cut? Bakhmut, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that Bakhmut is a pocket about to be closed. If you look at the situation around Bakhmut, at least according to the data that we have, Bakhmut, well, you could say this isn't 100% an accurate representation, which is 100% correct. This does give you a good idea, because this is what we have been able to identify. And this is what we've been able to find some kind of evidence to prove this is the situation there on the ground. And Bakhmut has one major road really leading in and out of the city, and that is this one right here. The Otvoshlik T0504. So the T0504 highway is really the last one entering this city. And while that makes it an easy target for incoming supplies and equipment, it also means that there's still a way to supply the city, regularly. And the amount of forces in Bakhmut doesn't necessarily make it an easy encirclement movement. We have seen time and time and time again of the Russians failing to properly encircle a city, even with fewer defensive forces. Bakhmut has an extensive number of forces, ranging anywhere from 35 to 50,000 troops are operating in this sector of the front lines. And so that's the vast majority of those are defending the city of Bakhmut, And as we have seen over the last several weeks, many of those veteran units that have been fighting there over the last few months have been rotated out because they are exhausted, they're no longer considered combat effective, they need a rest and they need a refit and they need to be re-equipped and ready to go. Fresh units have been moved into Bakhmut, as we are seeing here, fighting pretty, as we've seen over the last few weeks. Those are the ones majority fighting, relatively clean uniforms, clean equipment, lots of reinforcements came in, support troops that have already been reinforcing the area, but aren't ready due to rotate yet. And so it's very incremental gains by the Russians, especially in the north, but that is the Russians trying to capitalize on their already strategic victories in places such as Soledar. We are not really seeing an easy win for the Russians at this point, at least from my perspective. That is an opinion. But you're not seeing an easy win for the Russians. They are still on the outskirts of the city. They haven't made any major gains in the city despite continuous bombardment, despite, months of fighting, tens of thousands of casualties, and you're not really seeing any successes for the Russians in the near future either. They simply don't have the manpower, the equipment, the expertise to really take the city. They're trying to brute force it, and it's coming at a very high cost, and a cost that, as we have seen to some extent, the Russians just simply can't. They can't tank that. They just can't. The Wagner Group is actually, becoming much more open. Prigozhin especially. Prigozhin has become much more open about the fact that his troops don't have enough support to do the task at hand. And that has become a very big growing call from Prigozhin, who is the founder of those forces, of the Wagner Group. And we're likely to see, them not be able to kind of complete the task because of a lack of ammunition, of troops, of equipment, and the other needs. He has a follow-on question about that. So if Bakhmut falls, then what? Do they have follow-on forces to exploit? I would say that the Russians likely have a minimal amount of troops to exploit, so there would be minimal exploitation, but you're likely going to see, before the city falls, the likelihood that it falls in a mass, just a rout. There's different types of the city's falling. Most of the time throughout the war, we haven't seen Ukrainian forces rout, meaning they haven't just retreat and it's not a organized effort. We've seen tactical withdrawals from the Ukrainians. Even if you look at pretty severe situations in, say, Lysychansk and Soledar, Rubizhne, CRIMEA, you talk about any of these areas here. They withdrew in a very tactical way, and the Russians only exploited up into the border of the Luhansk Oblast. And once they got into the Donetsk Oblast, they were kind of stopped again. And we can kind of expect that if Bakhmut was to fall, that the engineers for the Ukrainian forces, if they aren't already, are likely to be preparing to try to exploit, or preparing another set of defensive lines in the event that does happen, in order to minimize the exploitation capabilities of the Russian forces. They do have enough to, do a little bit of exploitation, but not really a lot. They've taken just too many losses here. There's just not enough manpower and equipment, and if they were, it'd be susceptible to a counterattack as well, which could see all of those losses quickly rolled back against them. We do see Ukrainian leadership, military leadership, entering here. And we do see them actually going to Bakhmut. They're on the ground to observe the situation there for themselves and make determinations here. We do see a nice photo segment that has been released here from Maryan and Kushnir. These are Ukrainian forces in the city of Bakhmut. Got a nice Mark 19 Mod 3 sitting there. And if anyone's asking, that is my least favorite machine gun. We come over here to Mirnograd, which was one of several sites that were hit with S-300 missiles. At least 2 of them struck the city, and specifically they struck civilian residential areas. Luckily, however, no civilian casualties were reported by the regional authorities. We got a photo segment here, kind of showing you some of the damage. Mostly shrapnel damage. However, all throughout the Donbass, not just the Donetsk region, a mass attack of S-300 missiles did occur. Quote, during the night's massive missile attack on Ukraine, Russian forces hit Zaporizhia with S-300 missiles. One of the infrastructure objects was damaged, but there were no victims. Moreover, the missile strike on the island of Khortytsia was recorded, and where the administration building caught fire. Artillery shelling took place in Nikopol in the Dnipropetrovsk region. 6 houses, a car, and a power line were damaged. Russian troops also launched the missile attack on Mirorod in the Donetsk region. The local guard and garage were damaged, and that's coming from Andriy Yermak, the head of the presidential office. As we come down here to Crimea, we hit the main topic of the night, and that is that unfortunately, we are now marking the 9th year of occupation for Crimea. So many people don't realize how long this has happened and been ongoing. But the Russo-Ukrainian War has been happening for 9 continuous years. The invasion on February the 24th was just kind of the newest phase of the war. And so, to give you an idea, 9 years ago, Russian forces invaded Crimea without wearing insignia or posing as local militia forces, once again against the Geneva Convention to do this. These units include the 31st Air Assault Brigade, the 18th Motor Rifle Brigade, and the 22nd Spetsnaz Brigade, as well as the Black Sea Fleet, which ended up blockading the Ukrainian fleets in their ports. As Russian forces came in, they took over the parliamentary and administrative buildings of the autonomous region of Crimea. After they secured the main airports, IL-76s transported additional Russian forces into their holdings. This is why Russian forces for a very long time were known as the Little Green Men. They wore Russian military uniforms, they carried Russian military equipment, and they spoke Russian. However, they wore no military insignias to identify them as any nation. And so, during a very closed-door session to which no press were allowed, and there was questions as to even if members of parliament were even in session, it was reported that a vote had been made to give Crimea greater autonomy under occupation. An internationally unrecognized referendum was then completed in May, annexing, quote-unquote, Crimea and bringing it under Russian control, which it was already occupied by. Since the beginning of the Russian occupation of Crimea, Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars have been stripped of their language and culture by Russian laws, particularly in education and officially used languages for legal documentation. Attempts to organize Ukrainian or Tatar communities and organizations has led to political persecution of key individuals, several of which have already actually died in Russian captivity. President Zelensky stated that the war began in Crimea and so it will end there. Part of the overall objectives of the Ukrainian forces throughout the duration of their war and part of their victory requirements, their victory conditions for this war, is the complete liberation of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and including the entirety of the Donbass, back to their pre-2014 boundaries. Coming from President Zelensky's official Twitter. 9 years ago, Russian aggression began in Crimea. By returning to Crimea, we will restore peace. This is our land, our people, our history. We return the Ukrainian flag to every corner of Ukraine. Coming from Rosalind Stefanchuk, who's the leader of the Verkhovna Rada, or the Ukrainian parliament. And also the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Now, this flag that you're seeing here, this is the flag of the Crimean Tatars. And this, once again, also features, a trident symbol. Of course, you have to remember much of this region was, inhabited with Greek colonies. But this flag, really for an identification of the Crimean Tatars, more or less actually goes back to the time of the Crimean Khanate. But that is all the news inside of the country of Ukraine. But that's not everything inside of the world, as there is a ton of other stuff that has been happening throughout the world. And of course, we start off with the international news with Russia and Belarus. So first of all, we start off over here in Belgorod, just across the border from Ukraine, just across in the Kharkiv Oblast, where Belgorod, where several rogue drones, 3 drones so far, have been actually shot down over the city. At least one was downed by the city's air defense system. Some speculate that the drones are Russian Granat 4 drones. However, their tails look relatively different. And it's possible that these are actually Ukrainian drones.
Ебать, вы что, ебанулись там? Охуенно!
So this is a down drone that we're seeing here. What's left of it. And reportedly, this is carrying British L-22A1 PE8 explosives or demolition slabs. Coming up here and into Moscow, Putin has awarded Steven Seagal with the Order of Friendship. This is for his great contribution for developing international cultural humanitarian cooperation. Never forget that Seagal personally visited Olenivka prison in an attempt to field a propaganda hit piece about the defenders of Mariupol. Yeah, so he went to Olenivka after they were massacred. Steven Seagal, who was an American actor back in the 80s and 90s, fled the United States because he was currently facing a lot of legal issues. He was granted asylum in Russia. A Russian general ended up getting relatively creative. Things don't just get erased from the internet and from technology, folks, because everything you have and everything that you've done at some point, if you were smart enough, can be traced. And this Russian general is no different. This Russian general got very creative as Lieutenant General Alexander Matovnikov decided to do a striptease dance. This video was no doubt released by the Russian Wagner Group, which has been disputing between Prigozhin and the founder of the organization and the Russian Ministry of Defense, which does continue. I'm not going to burn anyone's eyes, but needless to say, that is the man. And that is the beginning to the video. We're not going to go there. And we can also see what real Russian heroes are like, apparently. So, we have talked quite extensively about how it doesn't matter what crime you have committed in Russia. If you are willing to fight for the Wagner Group for 6 months, you will be rewarded. And that's what happened to Artyom Reshetnikov, who was recently killed in Ukraine. He is to be posthumously awarded the Order of Courage. It has been revealed that Artyom was a convicted pedophile who was sentenced in 2018 for repeated abuse of boys aged 10 to 12. And we do have the ntv.ru from the Rio Novosti article about his 2018 case.
Педагог по специальности Артем Решетников сегодня в окружении конвоиров. По материалам дела он на протяжении 6 лет развращал детей. Мужчина устраивался на работу в дошкольные учреждения и оздоровительные лагеря. Разоблачить обвиняемого удалось его же коллегам. Ночью вожатые не досчитались одного ребенка. Подняли тревогу, начали искать. Проверили несколько корпусов. В итоге решили заглянуть в комнату к Решетникову.
Way to go, guys. So, yeah. And it would appear that Russia has a, well, population issue. A bill was introduced to the Russian State Duma to ban child-free propaganda to children. In the model of the 2013 gay propaganda law, Russian legislators have introduced a bill that would ban the media promoting the voluntary refusal to have children among minors, painting the child-free movement as a threat to the Russia's population stability. Coming from Medusa. So that kind of really completes a full circle in talks when we're talking about the Russian Federation. Because think about this. The Russians have talked about, so we're seeing the removal of, we're seeing the, forced deportation of children, which is, genocide under the 1949 Geneva Conventions and the 1993 Rome Statute. Over 16,000 children. We are seeing the extermination of Ukrainian heritage and culture inside of Ukraine itself. Official legislature is in Russian, if you're in occupied areas, including Crimea. Literature. The difference between 2014 and 2016, over 16,000 children attended Ukrainian language Ukrainian language courses in Crimea in 2014. 16,000. According to the Russian numbers, with those numbers being even lower, more than likely, according to human rights groups, that number by 2016 drops to just over 600. Despite being a official language, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar does not actually pop up as a language on official documentation inside of Crimea. Similar situations are ongoing in Mariupol and in Melitopol. Mariupol alone, we saw entire books, entire libraries worth of books being thrown out because they were related to Ukrainian, so they were Ukrainian government propaganda. Despite some of these books existing even back into the time of the USSR and even prior to that. So it is a destruction of a culture and of a people and of a language, of an identity. And that is a genocide based off of national lines, which is clearly defined in the 1949 Geneva Convention and based in clearly defined once again in the 1993 Rome Statute. Something that is equally similar to that and something that follows that pattern is our population problem mentality. You look at Hitler's Germany, right? You look at Hitler's Germany under the Nazi regime, under the Third Reich, and what does he talk about? He's talking about Lebensraum. He's talking about growing. First of all, his idea for taking over Czechoslovakia was because the Sudetenland has an ethnic German group there that is being, attacked by the Czechoslovakian authorities, right? They're being discriminated against. There's actually a genocide being perpetrated against them, according to Hitler. And what does he do? He says for Lebensraum, we need to secure this area, and it's actually appeased in many cases, by most of the parties, except for Czechoslovakia, who wasn't invited to those talks. And what happens? He takes over the entirety of Czechoslovakia. Immediately begins exterminating the Jews and any other unwanted individuals in that group. Poles also suffered horrendously under the Nazis, as well as everyone else in Europe, minus Switzerland, who remains, neutral the entire conflict. And the whole point was to grow a land space for Aryans. blonde hair, blue-eyed Germans, ethnic Germans, that was Hitler's ideology of what an Aryan was, based off of eugenics, which we know is very much no longer a thing that should exist. But it was, he put in population control measures. And this wasn't population control measures as in just stopping the birth of certain people, such as the Jews, but implementing and pushing for German girls to go and get pregnant, many times at very young ages, by sending them to camps and things like this to be with other German kids, German young boys. This was a thing. It was to expand the German population while simultaneously removing the populations of unwanted groups. You see a very similar thing now starting to play out with Russia with the, making sure the child-free propaganda, right? That falls into that same category. No. We're going to have a population problem. We're going to have a population problem. As you're committing a genocide against a people in another country based off of national lines, this very similar ideology is now popping up of, okay, now we're clearing the land, we need to make sure that we have people to settle that land, and that we continue expanding our population while removing the populations of unwanted groups. Further just kind of illustrating that whole, what is this really about kind of ideology. Coming over here and into Belarus, specifically outside of Minsk, partisans reportedly damaged a Beriev A-50 aircraft. This is an AWACS aircraft, or an air control aircraft. Locals and military bloggers reported an explosion last night at the Mashalichty airfield, and that is currently being used by the Russian army. Belarusian partisans have claimed responsibility for the bombing of a Russian A-50 aircraft with an armed drone. If proves to be true, this is an irreversible loss, as the military analyst Kavalenko. It was one of 9 A-50s used to guide missile strikes in Ukraine. And the A-50 costs a whopping $330 million USD. Reportedly, both the avionics of the aircraft, including its engines as well as its radar dish, were successfully destroyed. Coming from Bipolar. If you want more information on that, The Guardian does have a news article. I see a book of 40 talking about, did you see the results of the Izium exhumation of the corpses found there? 12 children and only 24 possible soldiers of the 400 plus examined must have their hands tied behind their backs. We did, and we actually reported on the, we actually went through and we, reported on Izium. And if you actually look at the videos from the video for 1 year in Ukraine, some of the photos that are actually there in that, especially at the end, I know at least one of them come from the exhumations in Izium. And I believe it's actually some of those that actually were released again today. They were re-released. The Izium... The Izium mass grave is horrendous. And there are soldiers that are included in that, and we know that there are. But it's pretty, the vast majority of them aren't. But when you look at overall, and this is true as well, here on this channel, we have live reported 43 separate times on mass graves. Like, as a point on the stream, we have reported on mass graves 43 times as a channel. And when you're talking about mass graves being uncovered in a, from former occupied areas, when you start reaching 43, 44, 45, 400 plus people being examined, lots of children and stuff. Look at what happened in Bucha and Irpin, and look at Mariupol. I mean, look how many grave sites are around Mariupol. There's overhead drone footage of these sites, and you can't. There are tens of thousands of people that are buried there. men, women, children, the elderly, combatants, non-combatants, people that starved to death, people that froze to death, people that, dehydrated and died, people that, were brutally murdered, people that are all sorts of things. And those are just the ones that were buried, because if they're so decomposed, they're actually just taking them out with the rest of the rubble, and they're going to use them, grind them up and use them for roads, apparently, to make cement. It's just, I've seen the talk about Izium, but after reporting in real time, and once you start looking at how many and you have talked about mass graves this much, it can become a little bit numbing, I think. And the reality is that it's just another report to submit to the International Criminal Court at this point. Something goes beyond, I think, a good measure of something becoming going past a tragedy is when finding another mass grave no longer makes the news anymore. John Scott asks, would you consider doing super chats like to send money? Appreciate you for your efforts. Slava Ukraine. No. We are never doing super chats on this channel. We're never going to be doing any kind of merchandising, and we're never doing any kind of monetization for personal gain of this channel. It will be monetized because you have to monetize to put on fundraisers. You have to do that in order to put on fundraisers. But we're never going to be monetizing this for like personal gain. The only time I'll end up actually monetizing this is when we are able to do fundraising. And that's going to be a while after we reach that benchmark. But 100% of everything we do here is going to be for fundraising. So once we get to a large enough viewer base, and once we have enough subscribers and enough people that are watching and everything, we're going to be putting a fundraiser, and we're going to put one in every single stream. And what we're looking to do is to make sure that every single fundraiser gets attached to the stream is a fundraiser that has to deal with the main topic of the night. So whether that is, Doctors Without Borders that are operating heavily inside of Ukraine and have been operating heavily inside of Ukraine, or whether you're talking about, if, say, the main story of the night after the war is over ends up being Ethiopia, working by the World Health Organization in Ethiopia, just organizations that we know are doing good things, and, that once again, they still fit our, 70% or more of their donations that they receive go to their programs, kind of thing. So that requires extensive vetting, but it's something that we hope in the future to do a lot of good with. That's been the goal for the channel for a while. It's something we always wanted to do. And unfortunately, we're just not large enough to do it yet. But that's why I keep doing this and keep hoping that things continue to grow. And I hope that things... I wish, of course, that things would grow faster so I could do that faster. But as long as we're doing good overall and we're reporting the news in a good way, I just don't... not a big fan on doing that. Most looking for, it says, a super chat with money donated will kick up your numbers big time. So most of the staff team worked with another YouTuber before we started this, who covered pretty much the same things, pretty much just the same thing, a little bit more hyper focused. It doesn't cover the whole world. And all they did super chats, and it went from, hey, this is just something to support myself kind of thing that, I'm okay with. I work full time, so I don't have to do that. You know, everything that is run here, all of the website and everything that we're doing and all the resources we use, you know, I just pay for, because I have a full-time job and don't want to use money for anything else. But that it went quickly from, you know, we are, you know, hey, we're going to, you know, we're making, you know, doing this to support myself, to a, wow, I'm making a lot of money. I wonder how much more I can make. And so it quickly went from being a good thing that was okay to a very bad thing, which is why we set out. Everyone agreed this is not a one-person thing. The whole group, we all got together when we went to start this thing and said we are not doing that. So never going to do super chats, ever. Never going to allow it. Never going to get anything personal out of this. I will be exceptionally happy if I do not make a single cent off of this. And to further that, I'm actually at some point hoping to, maybe at some point, once we get pretty big and have big support group, and if that happens, I would love to start this thing and turn it into a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and actually do our own initiatives and actually physically be the ones providing aid and reporting on what's happening. So that's some like far future goals that, well, we got to work a long way before we get there, but that's kind of where I want this thing to head, is to be a non-profit news organization, which would be, I think, the first of its kind that I know of in the world. But also not just publicly funded, but like non-profit giving back, to be a non-profit news organization and to, you know, just do good and report the facts. So, but yeah, I hope that answers why I'm not doing super chats. We jump over here into Moldova, where tensions are brewing in Moldova. The Hungarian airline Wizz Air has announced the cancellation of all flights over Moldova beginning on March 14th due to security concerns. Quote, as a result of recent developments in Moldova and the high but not imminent risk in the country's airspace, Wizz Air has taken the difficult but responsible decision to suspend all flights over Chisinau starting on March 14th, coming from their official statement. Estonia celebrated its 105th Independence Day with its allies on February 24th. Apart from Estonian soldiers, Ukrainian and French and American troops also participated in the parade as a show of force. Now we know that the B-52 Stratofortresses, which were spotted flying over Poland, were going. So this is the parade that we see going through here. Estonian, Ukrainian, Americans, and of course that B-52. The B-52. Of course, got to show off the HIMARS, right? Meanwhile, in Brussels, an inquiry on children has begun. The European Commission and Poland are launching the initiative to find Ukrainian children who were illegally deported by the Russian military from the occupied territories of Ukraine. It's coming from the Kiev Post.
I have an announcement for you regarding an initiative that the European Commission is launching together with Poland under the leadership of President von der Leyen and Prime Minister Morawiecki in relation to Ukrainian children. You are aware of the dramatic situation of Ukrainian children abducted by Russia and sent to Russia for adoption. Indeed, since the start of the invasion, it is estimated that Russian forces have sent thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia. The abduction of Ukrainian children is a great social problem, a tragedy, and a crime. This is why, together with Poland, we are launching this initiative with the support of the United Nations agencies to address this tragic situation. The aim is indeed to join forces to collect evidence so that the abducted children can be found and those responsible for the crime are brought to justice. We will announce in the following days more details about this initiative.
You know, you work as a major politician. Could you at least note the Geneva?
I have an announcement.
Could you at least note in the Geneva Convention that that is genocide? Why does nobody else bother and, you know, even referencing like the most basic fundamental laws of war? Like, why? What image is there left to protect for the Russians? Like, what relations? There's no diplomatic relations, essentially, with any of these countries anymore. Just call it for what it is. It's very plain. I have pulled it up on this channel an innumerable amount of times. I should have it just saved somewhere so I could just click it and pull it up, but I don't. People make a basic mistake. Missing the fact, you know, as someone who's talking about, you know, we're going to start an inquiry about the stealing of children. William Young says, people make a basic mistake. They don't want to overuse the term to make it lose meaning. (1949) or definition of genocide. It's pretty sad when this fails to pull up. United Nations, the official website. Definition of genocide as of Article 2, coming from the 1949 Geneva Convention as well as the Rome Statute. And the Present Convention of Genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and this the last one that we're talking about, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. There's a difference between calling something a genocide and it loses its meaning, like what the Russians are talking about. The Russians claiming genocide amongst Russian-speaking people in the Donbass is preposterous to start with, based off of, you know, anything of what, you know, of anything regarding the definition of genocide. No one's preventing births. No one's doing any of that in the Donbass. There's a war going on there. Secondly, it loses, you know, the term genocide loses its meaning, not because it's overused, but because when it's blatant and when it's obvious, it isn't used. Anybody with some basic background knowledge on the situation at hand that doesn't have, you know, anyone that has a basic understanding of what has been happening between 2014 and now, and that is being objective with the information, not trying to, you know, be loyal to Ukraine or Russia or whatever, but is being objective with the information that is available, can very easily debunk the Ukrainians committing genocide against Russian-speaking people. For instance, Mariupol is one of the largest, is one of the largest Russian-speaking cities in Ukraine. Look what happened in Mariupol. Likewise, to not call something, but so anybody that's being objective can look and see that those claims are false and say very blatantly, and many, many, many people have. Russia got called out for it on the world stage and has repeatedly, and continues to do so. And if no one else will, well, I sure as hell don't have a problem doing so. But when you don't, if you can call something a genocide, and if you're wrong, if you're overstating the issue, there's likely still things that are under genocide but are still very much prosecutable, and things that are still capable of being prosecuted, right? Even if there is a legitimate reason for someone to call it, but it not be correct, there's likely other major issues going on that may be still crimes against humanity, maybe considered ethnic cleansing, but don't just quite reach that genocide level. When something is blatantly and is one of the 5 very simple, you don't have to be a lawyer to read this. This is on the UN website. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an international lawyer, and I know what this means. It's not meant to be hard to read. You're not meant to be an international lawyer. You're supposed to be the average person, an average educated individual, someone that can read and write, basic literacy, that can fundamentally understand what this means. So that way when it happens, like when they're creating a commission to find children, that means it's a genocide. When you have to create an inquiry for stealing children on a national level, that is genocide on national lines. By the 1949 Geneva Convention, by the 1993 Rome Statute. So call it as it is. That's why I hate politics. Just call it for what it is. The definition's on the UN website. If you are a member of the United Nations, then this applies to you. I don't know how much more simple that could be. It's not just no one needs to spell it out for you. It has already been spelled out for you. And with that Paul rants over, we continue on with the news. Off the coast of Italy, 60 migrants ended up dying in a shipwreck thus far. A wooden boat carrying hundreds of migrants off from Turkey crashed into a rocky shore off the Italian coast on Sunday. None of the children survived. 170 immigrants were estimated to have been on the ship. One adult was taken into custody after accusations of him being the trafficker. DW News did have a report on this. Coming from DW. So that was coming from DW, a German news agency, as well as the International Federation of the Red Cross. And that number did get upped to 250 migrants from Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, which crashed off the coast of Italy, killing at least now 33 people. The boat crashed off the coast of Crotone in the Italian region of Calabria, sailing from Turkey. During the voyage, she nailed to the rocks and broke in two because of the waves. Unfortunately, they said that there was quite extensive body recovery. Thousands of stuffed toys were donated to fans for children impacted by the earthquakes. The Turkish Super League game between Besiktas and Antalya Spor paused for 4 minutes and 17 seconds to commemorate the time when the first earthquake struck Turkey at 4:17 a.m. on February the 6th. Besiktas fans threw thousands of stuffed toys, scarves, berets, etc. onto the pitch during the pause to donate to children impacted by the earthquake.
Depremden etkilenen illerin plaka kodları ve tarihi anlar Vodafone Park'ta. Duygusal anlar, tarihi görüntüler. 04:17'de deprem felaketi meydana gelmişti. Kahramanmaraş merkezli.
Pretty wild moment. Coming down here and into the Middle East, we come out of Israel, where two Israeli, or specifically the West Bank, where two Israeli settlers were killed in the city of Hawara. During preliminary data, the attacker crashed into the car of the victims, then got out and opened fire on the driver and passenger. The victims were taken to the hospital where, despite the efforts of doctors, they ended up passing away. The Israeli authorities qualified the incident as a terrorist attack, and Israeli intelligence services organized a search for the terrorist. There is some images and videos, but it is very graphic in nature. In light of the horrible crime, the Netanyahu cabinet has approved the bill on death penalty for terrorists. The law is to be brought to the preliminary approval of the Knesset in as early as Wednesday. The National Security Cabinet will then debate prior to its first reading in the Knesset plenum. Palestine stated that it violates the fundamental human rights. There is an article regarding that on the Jerusalem Post. On the west bank of the Jordan River on the night between February 26 and 27, Israeli settlers staged pogroms in the city of Hawara. Attackers set fire to more than 50 buildings and hundreds of cars, according to the Palestinian journalists. The Israeli armed forces deliberately did not let firefighters in to extinguish the fire. Also, during clashes with the Israelis, about 300 Palestinians were injured. Some of them were poisoned by tear gas from Israeli security forces. There's unconfirmed information right now of at least one person being killed. You can see the destruction here. Jumping up here and into the area in northern Iraq, where two Iraqi field commanders were killed by a Turkish UAV drone. In northern Iraq, 2 field commanders of the Shinjar resistance forces were killed in a UAV strike. Another fighter was injured. According to preliminary data, the airstrike was carried out by a drone of the Turkish armed forces. Ankara''s actions were condemned by a number of Iraqi politicians and functionaries. Unlike other coalition forces that are operating inside of Iraq, Ankara, specifically aka Turkey, is not currently operating inside of the country of Iraq at the request of the Iraqi government, unlike other coalition partners, including the United States and the United Kingdom. In Kabul, at least 3 Islamic State militants were killed during a counterterrorism operation in the country's capital. The Taliban eliminated 3 militants of the Islamic State, and another was detained. During a search of the house of the jihadists, the security forces seized weapons and IEDs, including a suicide belt. According to Zabihullah Mujahid, the spokesman for the Taliban movement, the liquidated Islamic State cell is involved in the attacks on Pashtun nationalists and organizing terror attacks in Kabul. While in Pakistan, at least 4 people were killed in an explosion of a motorcycle. So apparently a motorcycle filled with explosives ended up detonating in the province of Balochistan and killing 4 people, injuring an additional 12. The incident took place in the market of Barkhan, where some of the victims are in critical condition, but no one has yet taken responsibility for the attack. In Cambodia, an outbreak of H5N1 avian flu has occurred. The Cambodian International Health Regulations reported 1 confirmed human infection of H5N1 avian influenza A to the World Health Organization on February the 23rd. An 11-year-old girl developed symptoms on February 16th and received treatment in a local hospital. The patient died on February 22nd. Cambodia has since shared the genetic sequence with the publicly accessible database GISAID or GISAID. The second confirmed case was the father of the first case, who is in isolation. 11 other contacts tested negative for H5N1, and these are the first H5N1 human infections reported in Cambodia since 2014. About half of the cases succumbed to the infection. Just across the border from Somalia and inside the country of Ethiopia, there is a very large increase of refugees from Somalia. 95,000 new refugees left Somalia and arrived in Ethiopia in February 2023 alone. A rapid assessment mission conducted by the Ethiopian Refugee Response Services and the United Nations Human Commission for the UN UNHCR and other UN agencies revealed the need for immediate food assistance and basic services. While down here in Mozambique, heavy rain has led to flooding and new displacements. Heavy rains between February 7th through the 10th led to the widespread flooding of Maputo City and Maputo Province. The rain has affected 30,000 people, roughly 5.7 thousand families, and displaced more than 400 and killed at least 4. 5 accommodation centers have been established to host the displaced, and the tropical storm Freddy landed on February the 24th, and up to 6 provinces were affected by the flooding. Flooding increased the risk of cholera as well. A cholera vaccination campaign targeting 720,000 doses is starting on February the 27th, aka today. For more information, reliefweb.international has more. Well, across the Atlantic, we land in El Salvador, where a mega prison for 40,000 people has opened in El Salvador. Since March of 2022, a state of emergency has been effected in the country associated with the war on crime due to its very high crime rate inside of the country. Due to the operation, more than 64,000 people were arrested. A new prison has been built in an isolated location in the municipality of Tecoluca, 74 kilometers or 46 miles from the country's capital. It is the largest facility of its kind in Latin America and is equipped with the latest escape prevention technology. And with that being all of the hard-hitting news in the country tonight, or in the world tonight, we now jump down and into Antarctica, a place that I usually forget whenever it ends up here on the streams just because of where it's at on the map. But something kind of cool has occurred here. A phantom jellyfish has been spotted in the frigid waters off of Antarctica's coast. A rare sighting of a giant phantom jellyfish have been reported by cruise liner passengers who spotted the otherworldly animals off the coast of Antarctica. A giant phantom jellyfish, or Stygiomedusa gigantea, one of the deep sea's largest invertebrate predators, met the guests while they were riding in a submersible deployed by cruise line operator Viking. Researchers estimate that the jellyfish were longer than 16 feet or 5 meters, with one stretching to at least 33 feet or 10 meters in length. Giant phantom jellyfish live in every ocean except the Arctic Ocean. However, because of these cryptic creatures typically swim deep below the surface, they're scarcely seen by humans. The jellyfish were reported at depths of 260 feet or 80 meters, and 285 feet or 87 meters, and 920 feet or 280 meters. Giant phantom jellyfish primarily occupy depths of below 3,280 feet or 1,000 meters. It's not yet known why they hang out in relatively shallow waters around Antarctica. Now that is pretty wild. Also, you can take a submarine tour on a cruise. Huh. That's interesting. It would be cool to go to Antarctica, I guess. I think I have future Paul plans. Not near future plans. Sorry, I'm getting glared at a little bit. I've always wanted to take a cruise. I've never taken a cruise before. Never been on board a large ship. And I have always... There are places that I would like to go to. I have gotten to go and see the world, but most of the world I've seen was not exactly the nice parts of it. And I can only sit and stare at HESCO barriers for so long. So I would like to go and see cool parts of the world as well. And Alaska is one of those. I want to go to Alaska. I want to go to Canada. I want to go to Europe. I want to take a tour of Europe. And I also want to go to Antarctica. Australia would be pretty cool. A bunch of the South Pacific, like the small islands in the South Pacific, would be pretty cool. I just want to go and like see the world, but at some point in my life, I just want to go and visit. But unfortunately, a lot of times you just can't. So, but in case you're wondering, there's a fancy one, 14,000 per person. Wow, nice. Apparently Iceland's pretty cool. Yeah, I would just want to go and visit like a whole bunch of the world if I can. I want to see as much of it as possible. It fascinates me, other cultures and places. We need a new car first. I know. Stop reminding me. But other than that, that is the entirety of the news throughout the world. And I hope that you found maybe some of this interesting, some of it's informative and informational. And regardless, I hope that you at least understand some of the situations that some of these people are going through. So if you can, please be sure to check out the wonderful... be sure to check out the wonderful organizations in the description below. And, give as much support as you can to them. 70% or more of the donations that they receive go directly to their programs, with 30% or less going to things like salaries and administration's costs. Remember, if you can't give a lot to these organizations, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. Help us grow our impact and grow the channel, and help us do everything that we can to try and help as many people throughout the world. That like and subscribe really does help, and we hope to continue doing amazing things in the future and have very high ambitions, as we've talked about tonight, in the future as well. In the meantime, my name is Paul from the New News. I hope that you guys will be back here at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central on Wednesday night for another 20 or 48 hours of news and review. In the meantime, I hope that you, your family, and your friends are safe. And if not, I do hope that you find that safety and security in the very near future. My name is Paul from the New News, and have a fantastic rest of your night, everybody. Bye now.
Going home. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлепуйло. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО.
Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям с кирпичом, даже танки и бачок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 тысяч лет.
Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО.
Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your number 11, shove it up your wrinkled butt. I will come and help you fit it in your skull.
Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Gone home, Russian soldiers, gone home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. Від стрия до волновахи і чудно кличе діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Ідіть нахуй.